Then Dave is going to come and help us better understand it.
Good morning. Today's Bible reading is from John chapter 14, the verses 5 to 14. John chapter 14, verses 5 to 14. Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing. And they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it."
Great, good morning everybody. Really good to see you. My name's Dave, I'm part of the leadership team here at the church. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about, if we can switch across to my laptop, I'm going to show you some pictures hopefully as we go. I'm going to speak a little bit about one of the verses that was in the middle of that paragraph that we just read there. I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's probably a verse. It's quite a famous verse. It's probably a verse you've heard before, I suspect. And it's really interesting, as I was planning for this, it's a verse that very immediately gets turned into this part of the Bible that we can use to start drawing boundary lines, to start saying who's in, who's out, how does my faith compare to other people's faith. In fact, just as I was planning for this and sort of looking online for content and reading about things to talk about today, the moment you Google these verses, you start getting sermons up on your computer that are almost reveling in the idea that this is a passage of the Bible that's about exclusion. It's about saying these are the people that get into heaven and these are the people that don't. It's about saying this is our Christian faith and it's different and better than the other faiths. If you look online, there's loads and loads of stuff there. So I want to start by talking to you about what I don't think this is about, and all of this is my personal opinion. So you should come and talk to me about it afterwards, and we should all talk about it. But I don't think it's about either of these two things. I just don't think it's talking about it. It's not talking about who gets into heaven and who doesn't, first of all. And secondly, I don't think this is Jesus saying, I've given you some sentences now so you can start drawing dividing lines between people. So I think when I come to read this passage, immediately there's a bit of me that thinks, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure how that fits. And just as a little side note, first of all, this is only in one of the four Gospels. So this is only in John's Gospel, this particular paragraph. And this particular thought from Jesus is not in the other three Gospels. So that's interesting in itself, isn't it? I mean, the other Gospel writers wrote their books, and they weren't writing their book thinking, well, I know it's going to be in John's Gospel, so I won't bother putting that in mind. That's not how it worked. Like, they wrote their books as a cohesive whole, and in those other three Gospels, it's not in there. So I guess you can only draw like 3 or 4 conclusions. either Jesus didn't say it, or they didn't know Jesus said it, or they didn't think it was important enough to go into the gospel. And sort of regardless about how you answer that question, the other three gospel writers thought their gospel was powerful and spoke a message about who God is and who Jesus is without putting this thought into it. So that's just an interesting thought straight away, isn't it, about where we place this thought. So why don't I think that it's about who gets into heaven and not, and why don't I think this is about why you can draw boundary lines? Well, the first thing at a very macro level, and this is a macro level, I guess my understanding of God is the God of the Bible is God of inclusion, a God who's always drawing the boundary further, a God who's always saying, I know you think you've summarized where love ends, but I'm telling you it goes further than that. And so just on the sniff test of this verse, like, that grates with me a little bit. Like, are you really telling me my friend Nargis, who I work with in another Oasis hub around the country, who's a Muslim and who is the most open-hearted, loving, generous, servant-hearted, other-centric person you've met, is really not included in the love of God and is excluded and there's a boundary line? Are you really telling me that the people I worked with when I lived in India, who are Hindu and are loving and other-centered and gracious and generous and humble and display all of the characteristics that I think are the fruit of the Spirit, are really not included in this story? Just by dint of where they grew up in the world, this sentence is something to say they're not included in. Just on that sniff test, for me, it makes me think we've got to explore it a little bit deeper. Let me show you a picture. If we go in a little bit further than that, I think obviously the core tenet in our Bible is Jesus Christ. And just in the name, Jesus Christ, we get this sense of Jesus who is both immanent and universal, intimate and transcendent. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? Jesus immanent, the embodied person of Jesus. We're just about to celebrate Advent and Christmas. God with us, Emmanuel with us, on earth, embodied in a person on earth. But also the word Christ, this cosmic Christ who is in all things, in all time, in all space, before time, outside of history, this divine version of who Jesus is, and the immanent with us version of who Jesus is. And that picture I've put there, when Jesus always pictured with his two fingers pointing up like that, that's what that is about in those stories. That is Jesus saying, I'm both immanent and divine, cosmic and intimate and transcendent. Now, if we believe in this cosmic Christ who is in all things, God who is in all time and space, all geographies, all time and space, that means we must believe that God is in all things. So God shows up in the birth of Hinduism, shows up in Islam, shows up on the cross at Calvary, shows up in the conversation between some humanists. God is in all things. And if God is in all things, that must say something to us about the way we respect and work with and alongside people of other faith traditions. But I also believe God is immanent. I don't think human beings can live their lives just with this, perhaps I can sort of transcend and engage with spirituality beyond another too. I think our story is this God that says, no, it's nearer than that. I'm coming to be with you and amongst you. And frankly, humanity need to see an embodied version of God to understand how this plays out in our world, how this plays out in our human world. God is both immanent and divine. And then I look at the story itself in John chapter 14. Now, this whole story, if you read there's quite a few chapters in John that are about this bit where this is Jesus talking to his disciples before he's going to be crucified. I mean, they don't know that, but Jesus is talking to them about the fact he's not going to be with them in this same way forevermore. And he talks to his disciples and he's calming them down. They're sitting in this upper room and they're talking about the fact that he's going to have to go somewhere and they can't follow, but they do know the way. And Thomas, in the bit that we read, said, no, we don't know the way, Jesus. And he says, no, you do. And so there's this moment of great vision going on in society, this moment where they're worried. The disciples think the wheels are coming off their plan. They've found their Messiah and it's all going wrong, and Jesus is calming them down, saying, don't be worried. In fact, one of the verses, I don't think we read it actually, but it just says that, don't let your heart be worried. It will all be okay, you know the way. So in the midst of this story where Jesus is calming his disciples and telling them they do know the way, it seems weird to me that Jesus then bungs in a little bit to say, but there is a catch. You know, you've got to believe the right things and say the right things and have exactly the right beliefs and pray the right prayer, and only these people. And by the way, it's a little bit exclusionary within that. Just feels like a weird adjunct into this whole bit of text that is about Jesus saying to his disciples, you know the way. It'll be okay. And secondly, I sort of think when Jesus is saying, I am the way, no one goes to the Father but through me, well, in that case, Jesus is the way. And if you look at Jesus' life and examples, Jesus' life and example was always reaching out, hanging out with the people that you didn't expect him to be hanging out, saying, if you think you've found the boundary of inclusion, I tell you we can draw another circle. It goes further than that. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. If you think there are some people that are outside this story, I tell you they're inside this story. If you're going to critique people for not following the way, and yet I see them following the way, that is the way. Jesus is always pushing the boundary. So how can it be when Jesus says, I am the way, no one goes to the Father but through me, we then say, Jesus meant something other than what he did in his life? So I don't think this is about exclusion at all. I just don't think it's talking about those things. It's not talking about who goes to heaven. So you could do a whole different sermon on that. It's just literally not talking about it. Neither do I think it's talking about how you can start defining Christianity different to all the other religions. I think it's talking about something else. I think Jesus is making a really strong point here, though, so I'm not watering it down. Jesus is saying, I am the way. Jesus is saying he's the path. And I think that the word way was quite interesting to me as I was thinking about this. I think I've sometimes thought about that as the way means the destination, or it means the route map, or it means the journey. And perhaps it does mean all of those things. But what about if it means the literal path you stand on? Like the way, like the bridle way or the byway, like the path I stand on. Jesus is saying, I am the ground you need to stand on if you want to understand God. If you want to understand the point of the universe, look no further than me. I mean, not me, Jesus, but if you want to understand the point of the universe, here it is. If you want to understand God in God's fullness, here's how it's embodied in the context of this world and in the frame of being a human. If you want to understand the fullest sense of what God looks like, you can do no better than look at my way. I think that's what Jesus is saying, and that's a really powerful statement, isn't it? And I sort of think he was saying, he didn't say these words, obviously, but I sort of think he's saying, do what you like with that thought. I'm telling you, I am the way. This is the fullest representation of what God looks like. What he's not saying is, Jesus didn't come to set up a religion. He didn't come to set up Christianity. So Jesus didn't say Christianity is the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father apart from through Christianity. Doing a complete, for a start, Jesus is a Jew, but secondly, that's just not what he's doing. He's saying, I can do not much else other than tell you I am the way. This is what God looks like embodied in a human being. And I don't think that's exclusive. I think Jesus is saying, and therefore whenever you see the traits that are the way, whenever you see self-sacrificial love, that is the face of God. Whenever you see generosity, that is the face of God. Whenever you see forgiveness, that is the face of God. Whenever you see self-sacrifice, that is the face of God. I mean, in John 14, verse 9, which a couple of verses later, he literally says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This whole thing is about a paragraph where he's calming the disciples and saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I am the way, the truth, and the life. One of the bits that I thought when I was researching for this is I felt a bit unsatisfied. That some people who would say things a bit like that sort of stop there. And it's good to stop there, and I feel like there's some richness in that. But it left me thinking, well, therefore what? What next? What do we do? How are we supposed to live if that's true? If Jesus is saying, I am the embodied way. There is this thought, Brian McLaren's written a book where he's got some of this thinking in it, that says you can have a really strong Christian identity that can sometimes end up being a bit intolerant and hostile towards other faiths. Or the opposite problem. Sometimes we're so inclusive and wanting to be friendly with everybody else, we sort of water down our Christian identity. And Brian McLaren says, actually the point of this story is have a strong Christian faith that is then generous and open and humble and reaching out to the other beyond us. We've got to, like, what we're aiming for is a strong identity that is open and generous and encouraging and respectful and tolerant towards others. He's got this little sort of formula, which I'll just stick on the screen here, which is a little bit like Jill talks about all the time, spiral dynamics. I don't know if you've come across spiral dynamics, but it's like stages you go through in growth, and you get different colours of the spiral dynamics, and like these are like different stages you work through, and not everybody works through them all. Some of us get stuck in a particular place and don't move on into the different phases of the spiral. Brian McLaren sort of summarised this down a little bit, I think, into these 4 words, but it's a similar sort of concept. He says that human beings, first of all, start in or have a period of time in simplicity. Simplicity where things are black or white, where things are right or wrong. And he says you shouldn't despise that moment. It's important. Human beings need these moments of right and wrong. It's how we set up our like moral codes. Like that thing's right, that thing's wrong. I should do that, shouldn't. Theo, my little boy, he needs to know some things are right and some things are wrong. But people sometimes then move on into complexity where they realise that, well, everybody's moral code's a bit different to one another's. Everybody's got a different list of right and wrong. Everybody's got a different list of black and white. And at that point, people start adding together complexity and starting to like weave a framework around all of that and saying, well, this is how I think it all fits together, and here's a sort of meta story I can put across all of that. And you get this world of complexity. In simplicity, you're often in a world where leaders are quite authority figures and you're sort of taking their word for granted. In complexity, you have a slightly different relationship to leader figures, where you're a bit more pragmatic about that, and you're actually thinking a bit more about how you weave this complexity of the world together. He then says there's another stage which he calls perplexity, where he says some people move into a space where they actually deconstruct a lot of that and say, actually, I'm not sure that framework I put around the complexity really hangs together. And at that point, people go into these moments of real doubt and start sort of challenging the meta-narrative they put around things. And again, he says you shouldn't despise that moment unless you're like thinking about some of these things, and sometimes taking things apart, you don't grow and move on. And then I think he's saying ultimately the thing we're pitching for is harmony, which is the final one, where he says in a state of harmony, you live with a world where you can understand that not everything is knowable. In simplicity, everything's knowable, everything's known. In harmony, you have to live with a world where not everything can be known. You have strong identities within that, but strong identities that are open towards otherness and open towards other ideas. And you have to live with this idea that not everything can be known. Let me just give you an example of that in my life. So, in a completely different context. So I studied maths at university, and at school when I studied maths, everything was simple. Like certainly when I was in earlier stages of school, there were right answers and there were wrong answers. And 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm going to show you that pictorially, and I'm going to show you that with numbers, and I'm going to show you that philosophically, and that's the right answer. And then I guess as I moved on through my schooling, it became a bit more complex, and there was this bit about algebra over here, and there was this bit about number theory, and there was this bit about geometry, and I started hanging together the framework that fit all of that together. When I went to university to study maths, all of a sudden it became about philosophy. It was blew my mind really, didn't make any sense anymore. And they said, the things you've been taught at school just aren't true. What you thought was true. And we got to university and found imaginary numbers. Who knew there were imaginary numbers, And so there was this moment of perplexity in my life where I thought this doesn't work anymore. The framework I've put all around this doesn't really work. And then as I went on, I'm sure I didn't do this perfectly, but through my university studies, I think I got to a place of a bit more harmony where I knew I didn't understand all of it. I knew I couldn't know all of it, but within that I could know some stuff, and I could form an identity around the bits I did know, and I knew there were some other people that knew some other stuff too, and I could fit the whole thing together and live in that, paradox of I don't know it all, but I can put some framework around some of it, and lived in this state of a bit more breadth, a bit more harmony, a bit more, therefore, openness to other ideas. here's something I want to get off my chest. I can't bear that in our society everybody now talks about my truth. My truth the whole time. You know, like, does that annoy you? It annoys me just on a like grammatical level, let alone the actual like the thought process behind it. But like, we were in a meeting, Jill and I were in this meeting actually on Friday. So we worked for Oasis, and we were in a meeting on Friday where we're all actually falling out with each other a bit. Steve was there as well, and so you know I think it was his fault. But we're in a meeting where we're all slightly falling out with each other, and we all had a different view about a thing that was going on. And like everybody, me included, was started sentences with, the truth is X, the truth is Y, the truth is Z. And like I came away from that, just reflecting on it over the weekend, thinking none of us had a picture of the truth. All we had was our view of the truth, our broken view of the truth. Like everybody came to that discussion with, my best but pretty broken understanding of the picture is X and Y. But none of us said that. We all talked about my truth. And I think the problem is when we talk about my truth, we put a box around stuff that says, and therefore no more discussion. This is my truth, done. Well, I think that's interesting, particularly in the context of this sentence where Jesus is saying, I am the truth. I think Jesus is doing something slightly different in this bit of the Bible to us. Jesus, I think, is saying there is a truth. I'm not really up for a sort of postmodern world where there are multiple truths. I think there is a truth, and I think Jesus is standing there saying, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. This is what God looks like. However, we're doing something quite different in relation to that. We're saying our best and broken understanding of what on earth that meant and what the way is X, and we've all got a completely different look at that. And I think that puts a bit of humility into the system for us all. If we always start with our best and broken understanding of this truth is X, none of us in this room have got a handle on the truth. It doesn't mean there isn't one, it just means we haven't got a handle on it on our own. The church is particularly bad, I think, at two of the four things on this list. So particularly bad at simplicity. The church loves to, I think, narrow things down into it. It'd be easier if it was black and white. I mean, it would, wouldn't it? It'd be easier if we all walked out of this room with, like, I told you the right answer and the wrong answer, and you could go and have your lunch. Like, the church does that. There's this really famous story in a book called The Brothers Karamazov, which is a Dostoevsky book. And in the middle of it, there's another whole book that's sort of in the middle of this called The Grand Inquisitor. And if I've not read the whole book, but I've read that bit. And if you read that bit, it's this story about Jesus. It's a story where these brothers, the brothers Karamazov, are talking to one another, and they use this story of Jesus in Seville. And it's in the time of the Spanish Inquisitions. And Jesus comes back to earth in this story. And he's wandering around the city of Seville, and he's doing miracles, and the people of the city are engaging with Jesus. And ultimately he goes to the cathedral in the middle of the city. And he goes to the cathedral and meets the Bishop of Seville. And the Bishop of Seville, the Inquisitor, throws Jesus into prison. And the bishop says to Jesus, we just can't have you here because, like, you're blowing up our project. Like, you left far too much grey. You left far too much room for people's opinions and thoughts and freedom to, like, actually work out the way. And you needed to make it black and white. Nobody can live with this. So, like, since you died, Jesus, you know, we've made it simple. We've made it easier. We've made it black and white for people, and it's working. So we just can't have you here. And they, in this story, so it goes, they were going to put Jesus to death, and that didn't actually happen at the end of the story. They let him go, but they banish him and say, never come back. And this whole Grand Inquisitor story is this critique of the church, saying that the project of the church over hundreds of years has been to take the freedom and the breadth and the ability to say my best and broken understanding and narrow it down into simplicity for people. And it's a pretty stinging criticism of the way the church sometimes works. But equally, if we go back to that list, I think the church is pretty bad at the perplexity bit too. We have these moments of deconstruction and doubt and sort of taking apart of some of the structures, and then we leave people like completely unanchored to anything, And I don't think that's what Jesus is saying either. I think Jesus is saying, anchor to the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Anchor to that if you want to understand what God looks like. And I think we sometimes leave ourselves in a place of perplexity where now anybody's opinion and thought goes, really. And I don't think that's really quite what Jesus is saying here to us. The church is bad, I think, at simplicity and perplexity. Let me just give you an example of that. So, and we've been, we've got our 9 habits that we use in Oasis that are the fruit of the Spirit, and I think it is our best to be one of the ways in which we can be honouring of the way. If Jesus is saying he is the way, well then what does the character of Jesus look like? It looks like the fruit of the Spirit, loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind. Therefore, here are our 9 habits, and how do we play that out in the world? But we've been making, Nathan I think made these, but some posters to go on the walls where we've got these 9 words, and then underneath them like a definition of what that word means. And that's been a fascinating process, because like everybody's got a different definition of what hopeful means. And like you sit and talk to me and I'll give you one, and Jill will give you a different one, and Danielle will give you a different one. And like, if we're not careful, that's in danger of just being my thoughts about hopefulness. And yet these are supposed to be anchored to the way, the person of Jesus. So if we're going to fill words like these, buckets like these with content, I think the content comes from the life, the way, the example, the message of Jesus. And I think in that state of perplexity, that's a really important thought for us. So, I'm going to stop in just a minute, but I think it is our... Oh, no, just one more example before I tell you a fun bit. Like, here's another example of where I think we need to be anchored to Jesus and to our story. So, you know, like 10 plus years ago when Steve was writing stuff about LGBTQ plus and how the church ought to react, like, that wasn't just thoughts out of Steve's head. Like, he was trying really hard to say, what is my best but broken understanding of who Jesus is, what our scripture is, what the Bible tells us, my understanding of community together, but it needed to be anchored somewhere, otherwise it was just the thoughts Steve had in his head. Like, and I think if we're going to move on as a church or move on as a society, we always need to be coming back to our anchor point, to like the kernel. I think that's what Jesus is saying to us. So, I think our job is to be anchored to the way, the truth, and the life, because I think Jesus was saying this is the best, fullest version of who God is, but I think we've got to remain therefore open and in harmony in the way that I described. And so here are 4 ways that I think, there are probably loads of others, but 4 ways that I think it's important that we stay anchored to that truth. Firstly, engaging in the life, message, and example of Jesus. The more we engage in the story and the life and the message and example of Jesus, I think the closer we'll probably get to our best but broken version of the truth. Secondly, our shared experience in community together. This is not an individual pursuit. Like, we do this as a community and learn from one another in the process. That's why churches like this get together, so that we do this work together. Thirdly, transcendence. I think it is our job to like push ourselves into those spaces of spirituality, engaging with the Holy Spirit, if you want to put it in those terms. Like, I think it is our job to think about where we find those moments of otherness beyond ourselves. That might be through music, sitting in nature, it might be through prayer, there are lots of ways of achieving that, but I think that's another lens on us getting our best but broken understanding. And then finally, grappling with our big story as a community. Grappling with what the Bible says, what we know about Jewish history and Hebrew history, grappling what we understand together. And I think if you put those 4 things together, engaging with the life, message, and example of Jesus, sharing experience in community, finding spaces to transcend beyond ourselves, grappling with our big story, we won't get the perfect truth, we never will. What we will do, though, I think, is find our best but broken way towards what Jesus was talking about. So, in conclusion, I think this. First of all, I don't think this story is particularly about dividing lines. I don't think this is about who's in and who's out, or how we set ourselves apart from or different to other religions. But I do think Jesus is setting out the identity of God and saying, I can do not much else but tell you this is what the fullest picture of God looks like. You can do no better than look at my life, message, and example to find a picture of God. And then I think our task as a community together is to find our best and broken understanding of what we think that looks like as we respond to that. And finally, I think we need to build a church that actually is honouring of those 4 different stages. We need to build a church that knows that there'll be some people here that are in the simplicity moment and need the black and whiteness and need the right and wrong, and that's a good thing. And there are some people that are in the moment of complexity where they're putting it all together and working out the framework, and that's a good thing. And there'll be some people sitting in the room who are in that moment of perplexity where they're taking it all apart and thinking this is quite frightening, and that's a good thing. And there are some people that will be in this room having found a place of harmony, and then you go around the circle again, frankly. But I think it is our job to build a community that respects and honours all of those different stages as we look at this. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was helpful. And back to Michelle.
God of inclusion, God of expanding boundaries, remind us that love goes even further than we think, than we can comprehend. Help us to anchor to your truth, brave and aware in our best broken understanding, always connecting to you. Amen. We are rapidly approaching the end of our service this morning. Thank you so much for being with us. We're about to sing our final song. There are a couple of exciting bonus features that happen during our final song. If you have a small human, it is now your job to go and get that small human. We're also going to have our welcome team coming around with buckets and card machines for our offering to the work that goes on in Waterloo, not just today, but throughout the whole week. And a reminder that if you want to know more about that work, you can connect to our newsletter.